In this episode of Ideas, I talk with Chris Fussell about his book, One Mission: How Leaders Build a Team of Teams. We also talk about competition and how it relates to individuals on the same team, talk about organizational structure. We also talk about his leadership experience as a Navy SEAL and president of the McChrystal Group, and much more. I really enjoyed our conversation. He's just such a down-to-earth guy. He offers a lot of wisdom in this episode. I think you'll get a lot out of it. All right, here we go. All right, today's guest is Chris Fussell. He is a former Navy SEAL officer and is now the president of the McChrystal Group. Chris is also the co-author of the New York Times bestseller Team of Teams and the book he's here to talk about today, One Mission. Chris, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Hey, thanks, Adam. Looking forward to it.
And I just touched on some of what you've done, but if you would, tell us a bit more about your journey. I think it'll be really valuable for listeners to kind of see where you've come from to where you are now, and then the in-between. How did you get to where you're at today?
Sure. Yeah, thanks. I followed as strange of a path as anyone does, I guess. You can make it sound like all this stuff is nice and calculated, but it never really is. Yeah. I grew up in a really normal, stable family in Southern Virginia. Great parents. I was the youngest of four. We were a pretty competitive family athletically, and so I was the youngest in that crew, and so just grew up in this sort of mindset of a little bit of discipline. I mean, it wasn't over the top. I wasn't some amazingly successful athlete, but it definitely instilled a sense of team focus, a sense of personal accountability and discipline to the sport itself, which I think was an important building block for me. Was an athlete for a bit in college, and I went to school in Virginia as well, studied philosophy, and I think that was another important chapter for me. Again, I wasn't the most brilliant philosophy student ever, but it established a great foundation for thinking deeply about stuff, being able to read, write, articulate arguments. I've felt the impacts of that much more now in my 30s and 40s than I did in my early 20s, which I think that's probably normal for a lot of folks. What they study in college doesn't really impact until much later. And then from there, I went straight into the military. I'd come from several generations of service. My grandfather was in World War II. My father was Army Special Forces for a bit in the Vietnam years. I had an uncle in the SEAL teams in Vietnam. I think that combined with athletic background and sort of team orientation ended up in the late 90s going into the SEAL teams and was there for 15 years. First part of my career was first 5 years or so, pre 9/11. A lot of fun, a lot of travel, a lot of, very, very team oriented sort of place. And then after 2001, obviously everything flipped on its head. And so we were just nose down for 10 straight years, sort of back and forth overseas. I got married, started a family in that interim, but it was a really intense decade. And then 2012, I left the service, and I had become close with General McChrystal, who was a 3-star when I first worked for him on his staff. And that was like 2007. And we remained relatively close, as much as one can be in that environment, when he was much senior to me. And then when he had started this group, and a year later, I got out of the service and joined him right away. And so we've been partners here since that time.
So philosophy to military, was military then more of kind of following in your dad's footsteps? You wanted to be like him, would you say? And then studying philosophy, were you just interested in how thinkers of the past thought about the world? Is that why you chose philosophy, or?
I'd like to say it was something as deep as that.
Sure.
And honestly, I think it was probably like many others, like the people that I encountered that had studied that I was impressed by the way they thought. They were only slightly older, but people that I looked up to as an 18, 19-year-old. And so that attracted to me, at least taking the initial classes. And then once I got into the freshman, sophomore year level courses, I was really drawn to it. I just enjoyed reading that was very challenging. And a lot of it, I certainly had folks in my cohort. I went to a small college, so there were 15 majors, philosophy majors at the University of Richmond, where I went to school. My senior year has probably grown since, but I was solidly in the bottom third of that,
Sure.
Intellectually, but still really enjoyed it. And, at 21 years old, I couldn't read Wittgenstein and really make sense of it, but it was deeply challenging. And you would tease out these nuggets of, more than anything, like, here's how you construct a really powerful argument, and here's how you attack that argument. Here's what you look for in people's logic. Here's how you then rebuttal the attack, and this sort of back and forth. That's really what I found most fascinating about it. Plus, sort of to your point, those sort of the ancient philosophers' foundational arguments around, the intent of humanity in the first place. This really step one, first principle sort of philosophy stuff that I found really interesting. But then realized that those are building blocks to get to sort of modern Western philosophy, the Foucaults and all these, just brilliant minds of the 20th century. That it's been a pyramid sort of structure over, now thousands of years. I really just enjoyed that part of it.
Yeah. No, your story is intriguing. And you saying athletics and then going into the military, this idea of teamwork, your whole life has been centered around it. You've written books about it now, Team of Teams and One Mission. And so teamwork is something that has just been woven throughout your life and you know a lot about. So being a previous Navy SEAL, teamwork is something that kept you and your team alive. It was a life or death situation. So this idea of teamwork has been ingrained in you, not only been ingrained, but is something that is hugely important to you in your life. So kind of going on that idea, what are a few things about teamwork that keep teams performing at their highest level?
It has been for me just always been a part of my life. I've always been on since I can remember. Again, being the youngest kid, my older siblings were always on teams. I was always around their teammates. They were my heroes growing up, and then I was on teams, and then SEAL teams. Obviously, it's in the name. So, and like anything, if you grow up in something, you don't really reflect on it. But now, having lived in a few different spaces, and the work we do with organizations around teaming at a very high enterprise level, all the way down to the local small teams, I am a deep believer in the power of it, right? Teams become more than a sum of their parts. And that was the core identity. It wasn't given like specific voice like that in the SEAL teams, but you knew the culture was such that your individual capability only matters so much that it proves you're capable of getting onto the team. And then the team comes first. And that's how great teams become nonlinear, greater than the sum of all the individuals, and they can accomplish things at a much higher level than any math equation would suggest. And so I believe then also you can bolt that on if you have this right organizational approach and get, again, a nonlinear effect of a integrated teaming model inside of a large enterprise. And one of the first things that we wrestled with in the post 9/11 world was that sort of separation of we've got really good teams that go on the ground and accomplish great missions. They're really hard, et cetera. And so these 20 individuals right here are amazing what they can accomplish. And these 20 individuals over here are amazing what they accomplish. You can add all that up. But when we did the math, those 20 teams that are deployed into the combat zone, their efforts aren't adding up to success because they weren't pulled together in a cohesive enterprise level teaming model. So really that's what McChrystal did for us, was change that mentality that says we have to be great small teams and we have to be great at an enterprise level by scaling up that teaming mentality into the global organization. That's the hard part. How do you get that foundation of trust and alignment on mission and just that deep understanding of what you're trying to do in the moment that small teams do so well if they're built of the right people, up to the global level where now you're synchronizing potentially tens of thousands of people in every time zone. That's a totally different model, right? So that was a real challenge we faced, and what I find so fascinating going on in the corporate environment and many other spaces today.
Well, I was going to ask you about trust, and I'm glad that came up. But a question that I'm even more curious about is I've been on teams where individuals on the team are, it might not be said, but they're competing with each other on the team. Is that a healthy practice to be competing with people on the same team, or should people shift their focus to competing against other businesses that are out there? Just kind of a side question here, but I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's one that I think we'll always wrestle with, at least for all the futures I can imagine. And even at a SEAL platoon level or a Ranger platoon level or the most elite small units in the military, if you walked into that platoon hut and there's 20 operators, they're hyper competitive with each other. Sure, there's morning workouts that turn into a race every single day. They go into the range, and if you're the least capable shooter in that platoon, you'll know about it. But that can be done in a healthy or unhealthy fashion. the best small teams accept a range of capabilities. There's the occasional cyborg outlier that's just best at everything, right? But that's usually not the case. So there's a recognition that we blend all these skills together and we become better as a whole. And so if you're not good at X skill, I can point my finger in your chest and make fun of you for it, or I can recognize the fact that, but you are good at this other skill that I'm not good at. So let's figure out how to create synergy between us. That's where I think leaders come in, even at the small team level, and have to be that voice of reason to say, you're great at this, but remember the bigger mission is this, and no one of us is capable of accomplishing that. And only by coming together are we, and you have to keep that in balance because you don't want to lose the competitive edge that gets everybody out of the bed in the morning and pushes you hard, but that can be a healthy and positive competition, and leaders can really drive that discussion.
I've just thought a lot about that question as of late, but you also mentioned alignment, and that word is interesting to me as well. So what is alignment to you? What does that mean exactly to you? And then in what areas do businesses need to become intentional in order to find that alignment? How does team alignment actually happen?
Well, if you think of it at the small team level, if you've ever been a part of a high performance team, so that's 20 people, and you could be a sales team, you're a marketing team, you're R&D, you're a SEAL platoon, whatever the case may be. If you've got the right people, you're close, you get to know each other because you're just in the same space. You're working on one specific task or mission or closing a deal, etc. And so a lot of those small team dynamics just evolve naturally. And so alignment at that level, if you hopped onto a helicopter with a bunch of special operators right before they take off on a mission, and you just took a quick survey, like, what's your purpose right now? You get a really aligned answer. Yeah. We're going to go from here to here, and here's our objective, and this person's doing that, and that person's doing this, and we're going to flex to the situation, da-da-da. They are aligned because it's a very high-risk, intense situation. But you'd find the same thing if you walked into your best engineer team in the middle of a scrum cycle and said, what are you doing right now? Separate them from each other, and they would all be super aligned on the schedule, the timeline, how it rolls into a bigger platform they're building, etc. A sales team, a marketing team, everybody, when they get that intense small team focus, they get that deep sense of common purpose, right? Now, leaders can make sure that conversation is happening, and it's not a competitive one like we were just talking about. And normally, I say this in sort of the context of history, if you went back 50 years, 70 years, traditional management practices were around combining that. So I want that high performance small team impact happening on the ground level where great individuals are close to the problem. And that can be deals, that can be missions, that can be whatever the case may be. Then I'm going to stack those into verticals, and I'm going to come up with a much more deliberate, slower paced, but very intentional management system above. And my job as an executive is to roll up their accomplishments up those verticals, tie them together across the org chart at the mid and senior level, make new and informed decisions against our strategy by surveying the market and our competitors, et cetera, and then cascade back down what those small teams on the ground will do next. And so we can do that on a monthly, a quarterly, an annual cycle with very great control, lots of organizational discipline. The better we do it, the better our position in the market, the more money we make, the bigger we get, we scale ourselves, et cetera, et cetera. And now you have this massive global organization. That's oversimplifying it, obviously. But it was that combination of that small team, great human capital with real serious traditional management discipline in a traditional sort of hierarchical model. That's how the special operations worked. I mean, that's exactly how we were designed to function. Now, you take that model, which is exactly what we did, into the current era where you have the speed of globally interconnected networks that can quickly become flash mobs of tens of thousands of people. Those are now at least part of the new competition. If you stick to that monthly, quarterly, annual cycle to realign yourselves and create that sense of common mission all the way down to the ground, that network threat has changed, 27 times in that cycle. So you need to find a new way to connect those teams on the ground so they can keep up with that pace of change. It can't be up, across, and back down the org chart and expect to keep up with at least some, and I would argue a lot, of the problems that are taking place in the information age.
Well, I was going to ask you, that's interesting that you would bring up organizational charts and talking about models. Is that just a small part? Because you talk about it in One Mission as well. You begin the book talking about organizational charts, but is that just a small part of what you find wrong with the way most companies are structured? Is there more to it than that, or would you say that that's the main problem going on?
Well, I think there are two things. I
Okay.
would step up and say broadly, the problem is not with any individual or what we've put on paper or what we're teaching in business schools, et cetera. A lot of that is really good, and it's been established because that's what worked really well for a long time. We're in one of those transition periods, though, as we move more and more deeply into the information age, and we're still on the front edge of that curve, where the speed with which information can travel and the amount of people that can connect around relatively raw ideas, and I mean, it's not a brilliant example, but if I'm popular enough, I can talk to millions of people in real time over my whatever social media feed I like to use, right? The world hasn't seen that level of connectivity ever before. So that shift is saying, look, you built these models, these organizational structures in a different time. And some of that really works well still today, but necessarily some of it is going to be outpaced, right? So what we did, I say we, I mean, I was at the very junior levels when this was happening inside the special operations community. What our leaders layered on top of that traditional structure was also an interconnected sort of network system. So they didn't look at it as through a binary lens, like let's throw out the bureaucracy and just become a series of interconnected networks, just like we see on the ground in Al Qaeda and other things, because that's pure chaos potentially, right? And we can't do that. But the stability of just a bureaucratic approach is too slow. So they started weaving in the two sides of that system, and we became this sort of hybrid structure between traditional hierarchy and distributed network models. And that's what I would argue most industries should be thinking about, where you should and can move with deliberate top-down controls. Do that because it works really well. But when that's moving too slow to keep up with the pace of change, and that won't be across your whole market, but there are certainly pockets of that emerging, layer in ways to communicate and distribute authorities down to those that are inside of those network problems so that they can actually keep up with the pace of change. And there's a tension there. You have to live in both those systems at the same time. But I've yet to see another way to approach it aside from saying, look, this is the reality of the world we live in, and some change is going to be necessary.
You mentioning too, and kind of wrapping up here, you talked about just the speed at which we're getting information. I also wanted to ask you about the importance of speed in decision making, because again, being in the work that you have been in, the work that you're currently in, you had to make quick decisions. And so, thinking as someone who runs a business, making quick decisions versus taking longer to make decisions, I wanted to ask you, is there a way that you've found to know if putting more time into making a decision? Is there a framework you use? Let's talk a little bit about decision making. Have there been a few key points that have helped you make better decisions in your work?
Yeah, I would say for those that have a vacation coming up, I'm a huge fan of Thinking Fast and Slow that runs through Daniel Kahneman's work and early sort of evolution of type 1 and type 2 thinking, slow thinking, fast thinking. And I think we're all hardwired to be more dominant in one of those camps or the other, right? So I'm not a huge believer in just sort of the making accurate gut calls. Just no one's wired to just be that brilliant in the moment. When you see accurate gut calls, where they're really good, and you see this a lot in things like special operations, it tends to be extremely experienced folks. And if it's somebody that isn't that experienced and they do make gut calls and they're right, if you really went back and tease it out, 9 times out of 10, it's luck, right? Instinctually, yeah, you're courageous and you move fast, but you didn't know enough about that situation to make that quick of a gut call. Some folks, I mean, there were people in that community that had been on hundreds of operations on the ground and been in, countless firefights with real threats up close and personal. Those individuals could make incredibly fast gut calls, but they'd passed the 10,000 hour mark or however you want to look at it. They had such a deep subject matter expertise that they could make those thin slice decisions and have them be very accurate based on how they read the situation. So to your point, the lessons I learned was in that community, and I mapped that over to my environment now, don't overestimate your ability to do that. You have to work really hard to get to that level of acumen and understanding of the environment. Then you can make the fast decisions, but don't kid yourself that it's because you're just a brilliant gut player. When they're right, it's because you put in the work to make sure that you can read things better than those around you. And I'm still a huge believer. I'm much more of a type 2 sort of long-term thinker, which I've had to wrestle with from the other way, right? There are times where I should be moving faster. This hurt me in athletics. Wrestling is a very fast sport. And as a slow thinker, you have to get over some of your natural tendencies. It made some of the things I did in the SEAL teams challenging for me personally, because I was, again, much more deliberate thinker. But so there's a hedge on each side. So for those people that are long-term planners and very disciplined, I'm in more of that camp. You also have to say, hey, get over yourself and know when it's time to make quick decisions and just go. I try to use, again, back to your lessons learned question, I try to use as a benchmark. If I've made relatively difficult decisions in any environment, I try to stop and ask myself, did you know anything different when you made that decision than you knew 2 days ago or a week ago? Or how far back could you go and still have the same data? That's the point where you probably should have made the decision. Everything else since then has been just your own intellectual pondering. And using that as a tool, I've been able to sort of crunch that time up. I'll never become a pure gut player, but it forces you to really self-criticize that cycle. And on the other end of the spectrum, if you're making a bunch of gut calls and they tend to go bad, don't pat yourself on the back for being bold and courageous. Say, how much longer should I have waited to get the right information before I made it, right? So meeting those two in the middle. And then again, as a leader, you're going to have all these people on your team. So trying to coach them through that. Like, I love that you're deliberate, thoughtful, but you made this decision on Friday. You could have done it 2 weeks ago. So let's talk about how we tighten that up a little bit. And gut player, you're super aggressive, but you know that doesn't mean it's always right.
Yeah.
You went into that meeting unprepared. You should have slowed that down by 2 days, and you would have knocked that presentation out of the park, right? So I think it's critical for leaders to balance between those personalities as well.
That's really useful and really practical. I think that's something really valuable that we can all take. Because, I've beat myself up before. I'm sure listeners have as well. Like, I was too slow at making that decision. I need to become better. Sometimes that was reality, but sometimes in reality, I needed to take more time to decide. But there is a balance there. And Chris, you've offered us so much today. And this last question is something that I try to ask every guest that I bring on the show. But if there's one last piece of advice that you'd like to leave for listeners today, what would that be?
Well, I would frame it in what is just most interesting to me these days, which is what we're seeing in different parts of not just industry, but what's going on more broadly around the world and economic cycles, political cycles, et cetera. Whenever I'm with groups or talking to a group, I always encourage them, if there's one takeaway, go back to your office, your organization, your community, whatever it is, and spend 20 minutes thinking about if we, in our current structures, the way we're operating, when we move at full tilt, which we know isn't really a sustainable pace, what other problems are taking place outside in the external environment that we still couldn't keep up with? Like, that's the question that we took too long to answer inside the military community, all of us collectively. We just sort of ignored the fact that because we were so much better on the ground, we ignored the fact that this network terrorist threat was growing orders of magnitude faster than we were putting pressure on it. And no one stepped back and said, wait a second, what if the world is fundamentally different right now? And this is a problem that we just can't keep up with. There's no way we can move fast enough in our current structure to keep up with it. And so 15, 20 minutes on a whiteboard with one or two other thoughtful people in your organization, start mapping out what are those other problems out there that we're just not able to keep up with. The data's there, the teams are close to it, but they can't connect fast enough to move against that shift. In there somewhere, you'll start to expand and uncover really fascinating conversations. One, it'll get your wheels spinning, but two, then you can start to think, okay, how could we solve for that? Like, let's wipe the board clean for a second and say we could design ourselves perfectly to do those long-term and short-term problem-solving scenarios. What would that look like? And that is the holy grail these days, in my opinion. Organizations that can solve for that are going to have a massive competitive advantage, and those that sort of put their head in the ground, which we did for too long, can get to that existential threshold of risk pretty quickly in today's world.
Wow. Something to think about for sure. Again, thank you, Chris. Last question for you. Where would you like to send people to find out more about you and your work?
Our group, they can just look up McChrystal Group. We've got a consulting practice in Northern Virginia and Old Town Alexandria, and we have teams all around the world working with organizations on this sort of stuff. And our books are available on all the big outlets as well as our website here. So I appreciate that.
Awesome. Thank you again for your time.
Thanks very much.
Thank you for tuning in. I hope you got something out of these ideas. Go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss an episode.